Welcome to the continuation of the LinkedIn clone. In this video, we'll be looking at the NestJS and Postgres authentication. So as we can see, we're in Postman here, and if we hit the endpoint auth/register, we can go ahead and we can register an account. And if we go to the endpoint auth login, if we take the email address and the password, we can go ahead and we can log in by sending a request, and then we get back a JSON web token with a payload, and we can just go ahead and we can copy that, and we can come to our post request. And if we were to go to the authorization tab in the bearer token and remove our token here and make the request, we get unauthorized. However, if we put our token in and we make the request, we get our response back. So if we take a look at our database and we refresh the user table and we have a look at the first few rows, we can see that we get an ID, first name, last name, email, and password as per the front end application in which we'll input those fields. And we also have this role here. We'll be adding role-based authorization in the next video, but I would include this table column header here preemptively. However, what we will notice is the password is all mashed up, and that is hashed because you don't want to store the password directly in the database in case your database is compromised. So we are using Bcrypt to hash the password. And also when we log in, we will generate the JSON web token, which will be attached to further requests. And there's a guard on those requests. And if the JSON web token is valid, we'll be able to post to the database. So we can have a look at that. And we can see that for the author ID, that's a foreign key based on the ID from the user table. So there's a nested relationship between a user and the post. Ignore these previous ones. That's when I was setting up the code and there wasn't the relationship existing yet. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead, and since I've copied the JSON web token, you can go to jwt.io and you can go ahead and paste this in here, and you can actually see the payload. So there's a header which shows you the algorithm type, and we're using this JWT, and there's the actual algorithm hashing function that got implemented there for the JSON web token. The payload, which has our data associated with it, nested in this user object. And there's also an expiry date on the token, so the token's not valid forever. And then there's this verify signature here. So I can go ahead and I can type in my password. I believe it's JWT secret or something like that. Nevertheless, what you will notice is even if one character gets changed here, the whole the representative encryption gets changed. I'm going to start off by dropping the existing tables that I've done in preparation for this video. So we're using Postgres here, and we can just go ahead and delete these two tables, and they'll be auto-generated for us using entities as in a previous approach in a similar way to the previous approach. So I can just go ahead and close up that, and we can open up our code base, and we can start by going into our environment file, and we can just add this variable in capital letters called JWT secret, and without a string this will be pointing to the string value of JWT secret, and obviously this is your secret, you can make it whatever you like. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that and close the file. So I have navigated to the API folder, of course, because we're working on the back end now, and since we will be setting up authentication, we're going to need a few libraries. So we'll be using Passport and the Passport management to be able to do our authentication. So we can just go ahead and run an npm I, and we can just go ahead and grab Passport. And we also want Passport-JWT to be able to generate our JSON web tokens. And we also want the NestJS implementations of that. So there's NestJS/passport with the @ symbol at the front, and then there's also @NestJS/JWT. And we'll also want Bcrypt to hash the password. So let's go ahead and get those. Since we're using TypeScript with Nest, we'll want to get some additional typing IntelliSense. So as a dev dependency, we can go ahead and we can get some types, and we can get the Passport-JWT type, and we can also get some types for Bcrypt. And if we open our package.json, let's just check that the installations was successful. So we've got Passport with the Nest and also the JWT version. And we've got Bcrypt, Passport, Passport-JWT, and as the dev dependencies, we've got Passport-JWT and Bcrypt as installed. So what we want to do is in our source folder, we've previously created a feed module. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll create an Auth module. And we can do that with the Nest CLI running nestg for generate, mo for module, and we'll call it Auth. And what this should do for us in our app module, we'll add the Auth module as a dependency. And it also generates the Auth module, which is at the moment, it's just a class with the TypeScript decorator of module, which will be used by NestJS to detect that it's a module and implement modularity like functionality. So we need to get a service in our Auth module. So once again, we can use the CLI to generate a service this time. And in the Auth folder, I'm going to have another folder called services, and I'm just going to call this Auth. I don't want any spec files because I'm not going to do any testing, and by default it creates a folder, but I just want the Auth file to be flat within the services folder. So we can see we've got the Auth service. Now I'm going to also get a controller. So once again, nestg, co short for controller. In the Auth folder, I want a folder called controllers, and I want to call it Auth, no spec, -- flat. So as we know, the controller is where we'll be making the request to, the endpoint for the request, and responsible for returning the data. The server's implements the logic, and the model is where we have the connection from the logic to the database itself, or a representation of the database. So we've seen that we can create something known as an entity. So let's just go ahead and create in a new folder called models. We'll start by creating a user entity. So let's go ahead and get that. And this is going to more or less define our database. So we're going to create this entity, and we're going to call it user, and this is what the table will be called when it gets generated. And we can export a class, and we'll call it user entity. So we just got a TypeScript class with the decorator entity, which says that the table will be a user. So we want to have a ID, which is a primary generated column, and this is the decorator to auto increment. And next we want to have a first name. So this is just a regular column with a first name, which is a string. Now I'm going to duplicate this down and change first name to last name. I'm also going to copy the annotation, the decorator, because we want to have a email field which is also of the type string. However, it should be noted that an email should be unique, so we can add in these, we can pass in these additional optional parameters here to the column to specify that we do indeed want that to be unique. So we wouldn't want two people signing up to our website with the same email address. That just unravels a bunch of errors waiting to happen. So what I will do here is I'm actually going to have something here, which is the role. Now I'm not going to implement the role until the next video on role-based authorizations. So stay tuned for that one. But I will go ahead and define the interface for this ahead of time, so I can make my table and auto-generate it without the need to come back to it. We will recap this particular part at the very beginning of the next video. But essentially, in the models, all we really want to do is have a role here, and this is going to be of the type enum. So we can go ahead and add that. So all we do is we can, rather than exporting an interface here, we're exporting an enum. And we're going to have 3 roles here. So we're going to have a user, a premium user, and an admin user. So I can more or less just save that and be done with it. So that means I should be able to do a control period and import that enum type, sorry. So that means, and the reason it was defined as an enum is because we can pass in some additional optional parameters here, as we did above, and we can actually specify that we want the type to be enum. So that means we can use enum, which is of the type role, and we can actually give it a default variable. So we got So we can type in default here. And by default, whenever we make a new account or someone signs up, we want them to have the role of user. So we don't want them to be premium or admin, because they'll give them privileges that they should not be having. So we can just say we want them to be user by default. And now this last one here, it's going to, every user, it's going to have a connection to multiple posts. So for every one user, there's going to be many posts. So we can use this one-to-many decorator. And I'm not getting the IntelliSense for that. Oh, it's already in there. It's probably just not happy with the formatting of things. So basically, a one-to-many, this actually relies on our other entity that we've created. So recall that the other entity we created when we're making just the CRUD operations is in the models, we have this post entity. I'm also going to open this post interface. So this post entity in its current state is just the ID, the body, and this created at column, which gets auto-filled to the current date in which the post was made. So we actually need to reference this feed post entity, because every unique user is going to have 0 or 1 or more, so up to many posts that they can post to the feed post. So I like to just have the same name here. So this more or less gets that entity. So let's go ahead and bring that in, and we'll put that down here. So once we have the shape of the feed post entity, the feed post entity type, we can go ahead and say for that feed post entity, we can say we want the author. And obviously the author is not defined just yet. So if we take a look at our post entity, since we've created a one-to-many, we need to reciprocate that on the other entity. So it should be no surprise that many posts can belong to one author. And once again, we're going to require the user entity. So we'll bring that in and put it below we'll put our imports below the packages. So for the user entity, there's going to be this user entity, and it's relating to the feed posts. So the feed post is referring to this user entity here. So we can say that the feed post is of type feed post entity. And that's just one entity, so we'll need the array of that. And if we come back to our post entity, we will need to define the name of this column as author. And this is of type user entity. So as you can see, there's this interdependency between the entities. So let's just go through that again. So we have a user, we know they have properties associated with them, such as name, email, role. But they also, one single user, they can have multiple posts. So what we need to do is for the feed posts that belong to the user, we need to say the feed post entity that's in question, which is defined in this area here. Basically, every one user will have a feed post, which is just a nested object, which has an ID, body created at, and author, and where the author refers to this user entity. Likewise, the post has an author, and many posts could pertain to the same author. So we define on the post entity the author, and we link it up to our user entity. What we want on the user entity is the feed post, which is defined here. So I hope that's clear. You can't make one without the other. There's this interdependent relationship here. So now that we have our entities sorted, we can open up the interface here. So we did just make an adjustment. We added author. So we'll go ahead and we'll say author here. Now we will have to bring in the user object, which refers to the user class or the user user interface. However, we haven't such defined this just yet. So in our models in Auth, we can go ahead and we can create a user interface .ts. So we can export the interface user, and this is going to have an ID, which is a number, a first name, which is a string, and it's going to have a few more strings here. So just here, I'm going to change this to last name. This will be email, password. Now we're going to need to bring in role once again. And I want to just put a question mark here. Not that these will be null, but when we're passing the user around in various functions, we might only be passing a couple of variables around. And so let's bring role in and post, which is of the feed post array. So we'll bring that in too. We can save that and close it up, and close up our entity and our post entity. But if we come back to our post interface here, we can now bring in this user interface. So we've more or less defined the models for what I want to be working with here. So now I'll start to work on the logic of things. And we know that we work on the logic in the service. And I'm starting in the service because we're going to need to have some helper functions to be able to make our controller calls. So the first thing we want to do is we want to log in. We want to create an account. So what's going to happen is we're going to pass a username and a password along with the name and last name into a function that saves the password in the database as a hash alongside with the other variables. But the other variables don't have to be hashed, but we will be hashing the password. So we're going to use Bcrypt for that. So let's go ahead and import Bcrypt. So we're importing everything from Bcrypt as Bcrypt from Bcrypt. And we got the Bcrypt types. So we'll see the IntelliSense work for this. So essentially we're going to need to have a function here that hashes the password. And that's just going to take the password, which is a string. And I'm going to use the Angular approach or RxJS approach of using observables to stay consistent with my previous videos. So basically we want to return the hash password. So we need to wait for an operation to occur before we get the hash string back. And of course we'll need to import the observable from the RxJS module. So if we take a look at this Bcrypt here, since we got the types, we get the IntelliSense. So I want to hash the password, and as a first parameter, it takes the password that you want to hash. So that's just the string password. And then there's the salts or rounds. This is how many times the hashing algorithm goes through. So the first time you do it, you might get a bunch of characters, and then the second time you do it, it remuddles those characters up, and a convention is to just have 12 for this. Now we're getting an error on our observable, and that's due to us not returning this. So we need to return this. But also the library, lots of third-party libraries are using promises. So we just need to convert the promise into an observable to have our consistent RxJS approach. You don't have to do that, of course, but you just need to adjust the return type. But obviously you get more power with the observables, and it makes like more complex operations easier to deal with. And you don't get nested thens and callback hells and stuff like that. So that's just a preference, but there is an opinionated structure to things like Angular and NestJS, and that's up to your own discretion. So we're going to use this hash password function, and we're going to use it to register an account. So we've seen in the Postman and or the front end project where we built the forms out that when you register an account, you have a first name, last name, and more importantly, email and password. And this pertains to the user object, and hence the question marks, because it's not going to be the entirety of the user. But this will return an observable for us, and what we want back is the user. So essentially the user, it's going to have the variables, so we can more or less destructure from the user object. So from the user object, it's going to have the first name, last name, email, and password. And we'll hook this up on the controller if you prefer taking things from that approach, but I will need to write out the logic anyway, so I thought I would just come here and do it. And we're getting this error because we're not returning anything just yet. But what we want to return is, well, we want to hash the password, but we also want to return a user. So since the return from hash password is an observable, which is just a string, but we want to return a new type of observable, we want to chain on a switch map operator. So we can return this dot hash password, and for the password we can go ahead and we can just pipe into that observable. We can use switch map to tap into the result of that observable, which is just a hash password, which is a string. And then we can go ahead and return a new observable in which can be subscribed to from the controller. So we can go ahead and import switch map, and we can return. Now we're going to have to wrap this in from again, and this reminds me that since we've created our user entity, we do actually need to go to the user module and register that entity. So let's do that. So we need to have an imports array here, and one of the imports we need is using typeorm, the typeorm module, and we can bring that up. And the typeorm module for this particular feature, i.e. this module, we want to link it to the user entity that we created. So we'll auto import that as well. So we will come back to this module and we will need to implement, set up our JSON web token, but we'll do that shortly. So for now, let's just return back to our service, and we need to return something in this from, but more or less, since we've defined this user entity here, we can actually connect to it through a constructor. So let's go ahead and get a constructor so we can inject the repository that we need. So we'll need to use the inject repository decorator, and that comes from typeorm, and we're going to use the user entity for that. So let's also get that. So since we have that decorator, we can define a read-only variable because we don't want to necessarily touch the repository itself. So let's just call this user repository, and this is a repository of the user entity type. We will also inject our JSON web service token, JWT service in here soon, but again, we'll come to that as needed. But since we have the user repository, this means, and we know that returns a promise, so we wrap the core to this dot user repository around a from to convert it from a promise to a observable, and the method that returns the asynchronous operation is the save method. So we want to, in this count, save. So we're saving our credentials, or we're posting our credentials here. So we can save them. And I think this might be a good point to add in our controller. So just in case things weren't clear, I'm going to have a post method here, and I'm going to send it to /auth/register as seen in the example at the beginning. Now for this, we're going to need to import that. It's already imported, but we need to define a method. The name is irrelevant, but we want it to signify something. So let's just call it create, or register maybe. Register. And what register is going to do, as we know, we're going to pass in the user, so we need to have this decorator body at body parentheses, and I'm going to go ahead and call that import I will import it, but I'm going to call the object user as per our Postman request. And we do want to actually get the user back. So we'll have an observable of the type user, bring it in from RxJS. Now we need a body to this function. So all I really want to do is I just want to now I'm going to need another constructor here, and the constructor will be to inject this auth service. So I'm going to say private auth service of the type auth service, and through injection that gives me access to the methods I've defined in the service. So I'm going to say for that auth service, I'm going to want to register account, and I'm going to pass in the user. So that should be clear what the endpoint is. And I don't know where this came from. Well, I'm just going to delete this. Did I get switch map? I did not get switch map. And I'm also not getting the IntelliSense for that. So I'm just going to copy this down here, because switch map's a pipeable operator. So the observables, or observable like creating things, come from RxJS, and the pipeable operators come from RxJS/operators. So where were we? So we have the ability to hash our password, which uses Bcrypt to change the password into a hash. And then we want to take that user data, i.e. first name, last name, email, password. And so we use object destructuring to get that from the user object. And since we want to return the user, and that returns an observable of a string type after that operation's done, we can pipe it to the switch map operator. So we can return another observable, and that's going to be the save method, and that will be returned to us in our endpoint. So that will eventually be resolved, and we will get the user. So we have this save method here. Now I've chosen the names first name, last name, and email with intent, so I can use the newer syntax. However, for the next part of the object, for the password, I don't want to actually map that to the password that's in plain text. I want to map it to the hash password. So we've got the hashed password here. So we can just go ahead and just say we want that to be the hash password. Now, since in our user entity, we have not defined password yet, so we should do that. But essentially, for the column password, this is a string. However, when we get any information relating to our user, by default, I want to have this select to false attribute or key value pair defined in our additional configuration settings. So there was going to be times where we get the information and we don't want the password back. However, in this particular case, where we're registering the account, we want to be sure that we're not passing back the password. So in this case, we're saving and we're putting in the hash password, and to be sure that we don't return that to the user, we can actually go ahead and we can pipe, and then we can call map. So map is when you want to return non-asynchronous data. So essentially we just want to return the user, right? So we want to return the user, and I'm going to bring in the map operator, and it's erroring because we're not returning the user. But one thing I'll do before returning the user is we're going to get an object back, and it's going to contain the password. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete the user.password, and this just deletes it locally here, not deleting it from the database or anything like that. And so the key differences between switch map and map is switch map converts the observable into another observable. So we had this observable that returns the hash password, so just a string. And when that operation completes, we wanted to save that data using the user repository method, and then we converted that into the RxJS observable type from the promise, and that returns a promise. And then we can, since this returns a promise, this is now the observable part, so we can pipe into that observable, and we can use the pipeable operators, hence map. And map returns objects, arrays, strings, just data that isn't observable. So we're getting back the user. So even though this return type here is a user, we're sort of using pipeable operators to map in and return the user from the outer return, which is related to that type. Hence, when you get the data back, you've tapped in with two different methods, switch map and map, and you can when you return that, you're going to get the user back. So I hope that's clear. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just run a npm run start dev, which is the command to start the server and watch for it and watch for changes. And we did delete things from our database. So we'll just let that load up and we can see that the routes have been mapped. So if we go into our Postman here and we go to this post request here, so /API/auth/register, we put in a first name, last name, email and password. We make the request. We do indeed get the details back, and notice that we get role because by default we put the role as user. So let's actually see this. So let's come to our tables here and we'll refresh in pgadmin. And we take a look and it's created this feed post for us end user, and that's because of the relationship that exists between them. But we're not expecting to see anything in the feed post just yet. But we are expecting to see our first name, last name, email address, and our hash password and the user role. And then this primary key here, this is going to relate to when we post a feed post. This is going to be essentially a foreign key here for auth ID, so that's going to reference that alongside with the body and created at, which also created at also gets generated on the fly. So that's great. Let's come to working on the signing in functionality, and the signing in functionality is going to require JSON web tokens. So before we can even create our methods to log in, we're going to need to set up the JSON web token side of things. And I'm just going to stop the server so I can run the the Nest CLI. So I want to create a JSON web token guard. So I'm going to come to the CLI and run nest.js auth/guards/JWT, and I'm going to need to configure this, of course. I don't want any spec files, and I don't want any nested folders or anything like that. So we've got the JSON web token guard here, and you can see that by default it implements can activate, and it returns a promise or observable or some type of boolean, and the boolean essentially it signifies to the request that has the JSON web token associated with it. But it turns out lots of this functionality has been created for us in the auth guard. So we're using passport, so we can essentially get rid of this can activate method because we don't need it. And rather than implementing the can activate method, our JWT guard, it's just going to extend auth guard, and that comes from passport. I'll just get rid of these empty non-cord functions, and the auth guard, it has various types, and there's this JWT auth guard. So what we want to do is we basically want to use this JWT guard, but passport, it requires us to have a strategy to implement. So I'm going to come back to the Auth module as promised, and before we can register and implement our strategy, we need to register our JWT. So we've got that functionality because we installed a package. So we can actually import the JWT module from nest.js/JWT, and we can actually, what we want to do is call this function called register async, and this just takes in some options. So what we want to do is we want to, like, the way JSON Web Tokens work is essentially the server creates the JSON Web Token using the help of the package based on a secret. And we've defined the secret in our .env file. We just made it JWT secret. So JWT, it needs to verify that JSON Web Token, and we'll verify it in our verification methods. But the module needs to be aware of that. And of course we can just say, and these properties are in the documentation of JWT in combination with Passport. And we just want to say we want the secret. Well, we got that in our env file, so we can just run a process.env, and we got JWT underscore secret. Now we will need one more option here, and I think I might have missed the brackets somewhere here. So these two are actually, where are they? Here. So we've got our imports array, and that ends after the here. So this needs to have a comma here, and this type orm for feature thing. Just going to cut that out of the way here. Extra comma here, and add that in here. Okay, I think that's okay. Yep. So however, this should be nested within something else. So before I do this part here, the register async, we're asynchronously registering the JSON Web Token module. So we can use functionality from that module within this auth module. And there's a method called useFactory. And basically this will get called, and we're going to return an object. So we can wrap the in parentheses, and then we can add the secret here, and additionally we can add in some sign options. And let's just say we want our token to expire in an hour. We can say expires in 3600 seconds, let's say. So in addition, we're going to want to import our JSON Web Token guard and JSON Web Token strategy that we're working on. So in the providers, I want to get the JWT guard, JWT strategy, oh, I haven't created that yet. Okay, so we've got our guard, so let's create our strategy. So this is the jwt.strategy.ts. So basically Passport can be used in a number of ways, and since we're using it with JWT, we're going to, for the Passport strategy we're going to use the JWT strategy. Now, to do this is essentially a service, so we can add the injectable we can import injectable from nestjs/common. So the class here is going to be Jwt Strategy, and it's going to extend, or it extends, the Passport strategy, and that's coming from Passport, the NestJS version of it. So basically this here can take in strategy, which is also imported from Passport, and I'm going to write this functionality, but before I do that I just want to clear up this auth module. So now that I have the strategy class, I can inject it. Now one other thing we're going to do is we're going to need, in our auth controller, in the auth module I should say, to use the auth service, but we've already, that's done by the CLI. I always sometimes check that just to make sure. So we've got our guard, strategy, and auth service, so we can continue to work on our guard. So we can close this one because that's using the auth guard from Passport. But the auth module, I should mention, this JWT module, it's being registered asynchronously, and that's how it links to JWT guard and JWT strategy by providing it in this module, and then it gets rendered through, and then that will allow us to use decorators to guard some of our responses, as we'll see shortly. But I can more or less close that module for now. And if we continue to work on our strategy, we can, now this extends the Passport strategy. And Passport strategy has its own constructor associated with it. So that means in this class we need to have a super constructor. So we can say we want to pass the JWT from request, and there's a method called extract JWT, and since we've got the types, we can have some IntelliSense here, and there's from auth header as bearer token, and that's the one we'll be using. And we can ignore, so by default it ignores expiration, but we want to turn that off. And there's also a secret or key, and once again this is going to be from our process environment, our JWT secret. So essentially, okay, so I didn't actually spell this properly, that's why it wasn't auto importing for me before. I actually want to extract JWT from the passport. Actually, I want strategy coming from the passport JWT library. Yeah, I think that's all right. So essentially what's happening for this strategy that gets ran through the module is essentially when we call a guard, like a route that's guarded using JWT, it essentially runs through these steps. So it's going to look at the request, and if there's a header and there's a token, it's going to extract the JWT from there. And we've seen that when we made our post request earlier, we got a token back. We don't want to ignore expiration. We want it to expire after 3600 seconds. And then we have the key that allows us to allow for things to happen or validate things to happen on the server. So this whole JWT strategy, it's extending this passport strategy, and there's actually a function, and I'm not going to make this an observable because I'm going to keep it in line with the functionality that's being extended, but I think there's an abstract class, or it could be this module itself that was defined that has this validate class here. And we've seen earlier that we had our payload here. So this is the nested data of the user and the ID. It's just JSON basically. But we do want to take that payload. And this isn't just for any one particular data. This is for all of our requests. So it could be that we have a whole different payload. So there's no shame in having a payload with any type here. And essentially we just want to return that or a copy of that. So we can just use the spread operator in object destructuring to, and we see that there's a nesting of it. So it's in an object. So we can go ahead and just get the user property associated with that. And I'm going to save that. And for some reason I got a white bracket here, but that's okay. Yeah, so that's our strategy. So that means we can now close that and return to our controller. And I'm going to start with the controller just to define what the endpoint is, and then I'm going to define the logic in the service, of course. So the second auth method that we would want to concern ourselves with is the ability to log in. So I'm going to have a function login, and I'm more or less just going to copy this and then just retype login, because we are also going to have a body with the user request. Now it's just going to be the email and password, but because we got optional parameters set, we can pass through this user. However, we'll come back to this type here. So we could either say it's an object, or we could say the exact type we're going to get back. So we're returning, what we get is just an object with a token. So I could just say we're going to return a key value pair where the key is token and the value is the JWT, which is just a string essentially. So it's going to be defined in the auth service, but I'm going to have a method here called login. I'll pass in user, but I will have to come back to this to get the JSON web token out of it. So I can start to work on my Auth service. Now I'm going to break the login function into two functions, and you can potentially break it into further, but before we log in and actually return the JSON web token, we need to validate the user. So if we come to creating a new method here, we can validate the user, and this is just going to need the email and password. And if you're wondering where the user object is, well, we're going to have a second method for login which takes the user object, and when we log in, this is what returns the string. So it's going to be an asynchronous operation, so we'll use an observable, and we'll put a string in here, and we'll go ahead and we'll just return nothing to get rid of the error. But we're just returning the JSON web token string essentially, and hence we're going to need to map into that and modify it here. However, before we can even do that, we do need to check the user is okay. So essentially we're going to call validate user from the login method, and then we're going to pass in email and password. So what we want to return here is we want to return the user. So this is going to be an observable of the user type that gets returned. Now recall that the user repository, when you use the methods on that, it returns a promise. So I'm just going to say this dot user repository and use the from method that surrounds it. So I want to just find one, because you only need to find one because there's only should be one email in the database, and that's exactly what we're going to find it by. So we can pass in this object, and we can say that we want to find the email, and as a second argument we want to actually have this select, because this will select what we get back, and essentially we want to get back everything in the user table except for the blogs, because we're going to have a query later on that uses this data. So we want the ID, we want the first name, we want the last name, and we're getting IntelliSense here, so we know we're on the right track. Email, password, and role. Now I've typed password here. It could be that you wouldn't want some other properties and you just want the password, and recall that we made it so when you find something you don't get the password, but if you have this select here with password, it will override it. But it turns out for later on we'll need the other properties anyway, so we'll see that later on anyway. However, since we have this observable here, we can actually pipe into that, and essentially we want to return a user, so we can use a similar pattern as before where we use this switch map operator, because this will return its own type of observable, but we want to change it to return an observable of the user type. So we can use a switch map, and we can get that from, actually we already got that as seen before, but essentially it's going to take the user, it's going to get the user, as the user. And what we want to do is we want to return so sorry, I think I misled you before. We want to return the user, but we need to check that the password is okay first. So we actually want to return another observable here, and we can return that directly in a one-liner. So we can say, we can call the Bcrypt library, and since we've got types, we can use the IntelliSense. So we've got compare here. And the first password is the password, the unencrypted, or the password they enter basically, which is in a string format. So the hash password's already in the database because they're already created an account. Then they're trying to log in, so the password that they are logging in with is a string. However, in the database it's a hash. So since we're using the same hashing algorithm, when they get the text, if it's the same as that's in the database, it will allow them to go in. But we have to compare the string password to the database hash password. And when we're finding this and we're including the password here, all of these properties will be essentially what's in this user object here. So using that, we can essentially say, well, we can check the string password with the hash password, because we're getting the hash password using the user repository find one method. So we can just say password. And since we've made this into a promise, we can pipe into that, and then we can use the map operator, because we do indeed just want to say that so what this returns, the compare returns a Boolean value, which means when we but we don't want to return a Boolean, we want to return a user. So we can map into that response, and I can just say is valid password. It's either going to be true or false, and we'll just say that's a Boolean, just to be clear. Essentially, well, if there is a valid password, well, since we're getting the password again, we will indeed want to delete the password. So on the user object that we got up above, we can delete the password and then return the user. Finally, since we have the user, we can return to our login method, and we are logging in with the user, but we want to return an object, which is a token with the string. So essentially, I can pipe into this, and I can use the map operator, and for the JSON Web Token string that I get, I essentially want to return an object, which is a token. So I'm going to go over this again just to recap, but I will get the map pipeable operator from RxJS operators. So we've done quite a lot here, but just to go through it, when the user, after the user has registered, a hash password goes into the database, and we can see that in our database here. So there's the password, and when we want to log in, we take the username and the password and we perform a method, and before we can log in, we need to validate that that email and password is alright. So we match the password in string form that got entered into the form and sent in the request to that of the hashed password in the database. So since we are returning an observable of the user, because we're going to need this in the login method, and the user repository find method does not return, well, it returns a user, but then we also need to call the compare method, which returns its own observable, and then we check if that's valid. Now I'm not doing any error handling, that'll be in its own separate video, but you could throw in a catch error or something like that, or a multitude of things, to be honest. But if the password does match, we don't want to give access to the person, so we delete that and then we return the user object. Hence, we're sort of starting with a user object or a subset of the user object, mapping to an observable, mapping to another type of observable, getting a boolean out of it, and then essentially want to get back in a user. So we can, with that, we can work on our login method here. So we know from our request that we're getting the user, and I may have jumped the gun with this pipeable operator, but I'll just leave it there since I've already typed it out. However, we know that from the user body there's going to be an email and a password in that object, so we can use object destructuring on that user object to get those properties out of it. So in our return method, first, before we make the JSON web token, we want to validate the user, and if it makes it through this if check, it means the passwords in the they match. So I can say for the email and password, do they match? Now this is going to return its own observable as defined above, so we can pipe into that, and we want to use the switch map observable once again, and we can say for that user, because we're expecting a user back, for that user, what we'll do is, well, first we should probably check if it exists. So if it doesn't exist, it, you know, just won't make it through to the request. If user, and obviously you can add in error handling, and we probably will in a later video, but that's not the focus right here. If the credentials are valid, we can create a JSON web token. So I might actually write that down in case it's not entirely clear on a later glance. And I like to write self-commenting code, but where it's not 100% clear, I do add the comment here and there. But essentially, since we earlier we created this what do we got? We created a JSON web token service, so let's go ahead and inject that so we can use its functionalities, i.e. making a JWT token. So this is coming from Nest JWT, but we have configured the strategy behind that, and the guard as well. So since that returns an observable, a promise, we wrap it in a from to convert its type to an observable, and then we can say this JWT service, and there's a method called signAsync, and I want to assign a sync, and I want to return the user. Okay, so essentially what we've done here is this is where we're returning the object, which is a string, a JSON Web Token. So I can pipe into that, and I can actually go ahead and I can run the I can get the JSON Web Token, which you expect back, and from that we can sort of change the form such that we're returning an object, so a token associated with that JWT. So I'm just going to go ahead and run the server just to see where we're at with things, and if we are going to get our token back, and if any errors occur or not. So we'll wait for that to load up, and now we'll come to our /auth/login endpoint, and I believe I had an email, john@hotmail.com, and the password's password. Now if I send this, I do indeed get a token here, and if you want, you could copy that into jasonwebtoken.io, and you can go ahead and you can see the payload. So there's the user, and the user has its own object, and then also has an expiration date and a instantiation, like what the time it was created. So that's awesome news. So we can just essentially use that now. But just to sort of recap the RxJS side of things, we make a request to the login endpoint, auth/login. We want to get an object back which has a token and the actual token itself, which is a string. So we need to validate the email and password is correct before doing so. If the database hashed password matches the entered password, then we delete the password from the object, but we return the user and we say yes. Otherwise, it won't make it through that step. And when you call the validate user pipe method, it won't make its way through because this won't be returned. So when we validate the email and password, we get the user back, and if the user exists, we can call the JWT service to create our JSON Web Token based on the user. So user, and if we get that user, or for that user, if we pipe into that, we can get the JWT, so user token, and that's the token part, and then we map it to the token JWT. So all we really need to do is implement a method in which we can protect our route and also have the associated author with that route. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this and close this, and I'm going to open the feed controller. So recall that in a previous video where we made our CRUD operations, just as a recap, we had the ability to create a post and also the other CRUD operations. Now I want to put a CRUD operate. I want to edit the post endpoint such that it's JSON web token. There's a guard on it. So what I can do from this position is I can say use the decorator use guards, and that's coming from NestJS common. And I created that JWT guard, which is basically a class with a wrapper. So it's the auth guard from Passport using the JWT strategy. So now, since this gets invoked whenever something with the decorator use guard gets called for this guard here. So this guard gets called, which is built into Passport, and it uses the JWT strategy. This gets invoked when you use this decorator. Since we and in the auth module we've connected the JWT and set up the module and linked these. So essentially recall that the payload refers to this nested object, which has the user as the main key, and then the associated user with that in an object form. Essentially we're returning that payload, and we're just returning the user. So we're essentially getting the user. So that means that this JWT guard gets the user gets attached to the request object when this is made available. So since that request object has the user on it, we can go ahead and we can just use the decorator request, which is a request. We're still returning an observable of the feed post, of course. However, in addition to creating the post and having the feed post, we also want to have the user object. So let's actually just bring in this request, and I'll just bring it in manually. Now it's complaining because we have not actually added that argument to our service. So let's open up our feed service and let's go to the create post. Now I'm not going to add it to all of them because when we come to role-based authorization, it's going to have its own guard, and it's going to have things like, is it the right user and stuff logged in. It's like you have to be the right You can't just change someone else's post. But you can create a post if you're logged in, and that's okay because they'll map to your ID. But you can't just update one with a JWT. We're going to have another type of guard for that. And it's also going to depend on their role. So we'll implement that in the next episode. But essentially, we can return to this create post method, and we can add a user as a second parameter here. And it could be that we need to import user. So what we're going to do is we are going to create the post, and when we create the post, we're passing in the arguments for the ID and the body and the created at. Well, the created at just happens sort of thing, but we would like to have an author associated with that based on the ID. So since we've got the request ID through the return of the JWT, we can go ahead and assign that post with that. So it's going to be the foreign key and the primary key in the user table. So let's just go ahead and we can say, not here, but we can attach to our feed post, which currently doesn't have the author. We can set the author just straight up into the user, and they'll get handled for us. So we can just go ahead and return and save, and this more or less completes our guard. So let's just see it in action. So we'll come to Postman, and let's say we wanted to post something here. I'm going to delete this token, come to our body, and let's say this is a body. We post this, and we actually get the 401 unauthorized, so that's great. Now let's go ahead and use our so we've registered, so let's go ahead and use our token from before. And we add it to the authorization bearer token in here. Now we make the request, and we do indeed get the request, and we actually get the author back as well. So if we take a look and refresh our feed post, we can see that for the first body, we get this is a body, we get this automated created at timestamp, and then this author ID is associated with the author. And I'm just going to prove that, and I'm going to go through everything we covered. So essentially in Postman, from the start, if we were to register something, and again, I haven't done error handling yet, but if I change the email address to john2@hotmail.com, I get a registered account. If you come to SQL, Postgres, and we look at the user, we can see that now we have a second entry. It's got the same name and last name and password. However, it's got a different email, and it's auto-generated to role of user. But more importantly, it has the primary key of 2. So if I log in as this second character, I'll get a different token. I can copy that token and put it on my bearer token in my post request that's protected using JWT, I can send that, and I get, this is a body, ID of 2, and all of that, and I return to PG admin, and I view all rows. We can see that now we get the same body, but the second record, it's referring to the second author ID. So that concludes my video on authentication. If you like the video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm nearly at 1,000, so please help me out. And the next video is going to be super exciting because it's going to extend on the authentication that we did in this video, and it's going to extend it such that we can have role-based authentication. Role-based authorization, should I say. So, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.